Everyone who has tried to stop asks the same question. Did I break something permanently, or can it come back? Across this series, we've been mapping how these systems work, how engagement design fragments attention, how algorithmic curation reshapes self-perception, how reward sensitization changes what feels like pleasure. That mapping was about mechanism, about how the conditioning happened. This video asks what follows naturally from that understanding. What happens to the brain when the system that shaped it is removed? That question is now in the scientific literature, with intervention data, neuroimaging studies, and clinical trials that didn't exist 5 years ago. The answer is more honest and more complicated than anything you'll find in mainstream content about digital detox. Not because the research is discouraging, because it's specific, and specificity, in this case, is more useful than false hope. We are going to look at what the data actually shows about recovery, what works, for how long, under what conditions, and where the literature is honest about what it doesn't know yet. We begin with the data, because the first thing you need to understand is that recovery exists, and the second thing you need to understand is why, in most cases, it doesn't last. In February 2025, a pre-registered, parallel, randomized, controlled trial published in BMC Medicine had 111 university students reduce their smartphone screen time to a maximum of 2 hours per day for 3 weeks. The results were measurable. Statistically significant improvements were documented across all 4 outcomes: depressive symptoms, perceived stress, sleep quality, and well-being, with effect sizes ranging from small to medium. The study was pre-registered on the Open Science Framework, which reduces the risk of reporting only favorable findings. These are not trivial results. Recovery works in the short term. The data is real. 6 weeks after the intervention ended, screen time had returned to levels approaching the pre-study baseline. The improvements didn't persist. The pattern is consistent across studies. In a cohort study of 295 young adults aged 18 to 24, published in JAMA Network Open in 2025 by Torres, Conrad, and colleagues at Harvard Medical School, participants who chose to reduce social media use for 1 week showed measurable improvements. Anxiety decreased by 16.1%, depression by 24.8%, insomnia by 14.5%. And a smaller study of 31 young adults at the University of Windsor found the same pattern. 2 weeks of voluntary social media reduction, measurable well-being improvements, and 2 weeks after limits were lifted, 90% of previous usage had returned. Not 30%, not 60, 90. This is the pattern the research keeps finding. The brain responds to a changed environment, measurably, quickly, and when the environment reverts, the brain follows. Which raises the question that this video is actually about. Not whether you can feel better without social media, the data is clear that you can, but why that improvement collapses when the intervention ends, and what that tells us about what recovery actually requires.
To understand why recovery is fragile, you need 2 concepts. The first is the mechanism that makes recovery possible at all. The second is the mechanism that makes it structurally difficult to sustain. The brain is not static. This isn't a metaphor. It's a description of how neural tissue actually works. The brain reorganizes its structure, its functional connections, and its synaptic architecture in response to repeated environmental inputs. In the foundational framework of neuroscience, first described by Donald Hebb in the 1940s and since supported by decades of experimental evidence, circuits that fire together strengthen, circuits that go unused weaken. This process, neuroplasticity, is continuous throughout life, though its magnitude varies significantly by developmental stage. Here's what this means for the question we're asking. Neuroplasticity is bidirectional. The same mechanism that responded to years of algorithmic input, the same process that reorganized reward sensitivity, attention systems, and social feedback processing in response to platform design, can respond to a different input. If that input is sustained, if the environment changes in a way that persists. This is not a trivial point. It means the brain isn't locked into a configuration because of past exposure. It means the architecture that formed under one set of conditions can, in principle, reorganize under a different set. But plasticity is not uniform across the lifespan, and this asymmetry matters. During adolescence, the brain is in an extended critical period. Synaptic density is higher. Myelination is still occurring. The prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse regulation and long-term planning, isn't fully developed until the mid-20s. This means that inputs received during adolescence have disproportionate influence on the circuits that form. They're not written in permanent ink, but they're written in deeper ink than inputs received at 30. What this means practically: someone whose habitual use began at 13 is starting recovery from a different neurological position than someone whose use began at 23, not because one is broken and one isn't, but because the depth of the conditioning, and therefore the demands of reorganization, are genuinely different. Neuroplasticity is the mechanism that makes recovery possible. It is not a guarantee that recovery is complete, easy, or equivalent across all starting points.
If neuroplasticity is bidirectional, why does recovery collapse the moment the intervention ends? The primary barrier isn't biological. The mechanism exists and can be engaged. The barrier is that the architecture of the environment is specifically designed to deprive that mechanism of the conditions it needs. This is not incidental, it is structural. Neuroplastic reorganization toward recovery requires one condition: sustained change in dominant environmental input. If the input changes and persists, the brain reorganizes around the new input. The mechanism is straightforward. The problem is that the system was specifically designed to be the dominant environmental input and to functionally reinstate itself when removed. Autoplay removes the decision to continue. You don't choose the next video. You choose to stop, which requires an active decision against a default. Defaults win at scale, especially when attention is already engaged. Notification timing is optimized for low-resistance moments, late at night, early morning, during transitions between tasks. The interruption arrives precisely when cognitive defenses are weakest. The social graph is located inside the platform. Leaving the platform means leaving the network. For most people, that network contains real relationships, friendships, family, professional contacts. Exit is structurally tied to social cost, not just discomfort. And professional content, educational content, and civic discourse have migrated onto the same platforms. The information environment that many people depend on for work is co-located with the engagement systems they're trying to leave. There is no clean separation.
What this means, structural reorganization of the environment, the kind that recovery actually requires, carries real costs. Professional friction for people whose networks live on LinkedIn or whose audience is on Instagram. Temporary social distance from peers who remain on the platforms. Asymmetric burden depending on how platform-dependent your work and your relationships actually are. These costs are not personal inconveniences. They are part of the structural design of the problem. This is why the interventions fail when they end. The intervention changes behavior temporarily,
but it doesn't change the architecture of the environment the person returns to. When the study ends and the monitoring stops, the environment is identical to what it was before. The brain responds to environments. The environment hasn't changed. Here's the core of what this video is about. Neuroplasticity is real and bidirectional. The brain can reorganize toward recovery under the right conditions. The data from intervention studies confirms this. Short-term recovery is measurable and genuine. But sustained reorganization requires sustained change in dominant environmental input, and the system was architected in ways that functionally reinstate the prior environmental input the moment external constraints are removed. Every feature that makes exit difficult, autoplay, optimized notifications, embedded social graphs, professional dependency, produces the effect of restoring the environmental conditions that recovery needs to escape. The barrier to recovery isn't primarily biological. The mechanism of neuroplasticity exists and is engaged by short-term interventions. The barrier is that the architecture of the environment is designed to deprive that mechanism of sustained different input it would need to reorganize durably. That distinction matters, not because it makes recovery easier, but because it locates the difficulty correctly. You're not failing at recovery because something is wrong with you. You're encountering a system that was built to make the conditions for recovery structurally difficult to maintain. Now let's look at what the research actually shows, including where the data complicates the clean version of this story.
All sources cited in this video are listed in the description with full references, authors, publication, year, and links where available. You can verify every claim independently. That's not a disclaimer, that's the standard. We start with the most methodologically rigorous study currently available on this question. In February 2025, Christoph Pieh, Elke Hermer, and colleagues at Krems University of Applied Sciences published a pre-registered parallel randomized controlled trial in BMC Medicine. The trial was pre-registered on the Open Science Framework before data collection, which means the researchers publicly committed to their hypotheses and analysis plan in advance. This reduces the risk of finding patterns after the fact and presenting them as predictions. It's a methodological standard that elevates confidence in results. 111 university students, mean age 22.7 years, were randomly assigned, 58 to the intervention group, 53 to a control group. The intervention: reduce smartphone screen time to a maximum of 2 hours per day for 3 weeks. Statistically significant improvements were documented at the end of the intervention across all 4 measured outcomes: depressive symptoms, perceived stress, sleep quality, and well-being. Effect sizes ranged from small to medium, eta squared between 0.048 and 0.109, which the authors interpret as meaningful given the short duration of the intervention. The authors concluded their results suggest a causal relationship, rather than merely correlative, between daily smartphone screen time and mental health. That's a significant claim for a behavioral study, and the pre-registered design gives it more weight than a typical correlational finding. Then, the follow-up data arrived. At 6 weeks post-intervention, screen time had returned to levels approaching the pre-study baseline. The study documented both things simultaneously. Recovery is real, and recovery without environmental change is fragile. These findings don't contradict each other. They describe the same mechanism from 2 different time points. Limitations worth naming explicitly. The study was non-blinded.
Participants knew whether they were in the intervention group, which means outcomes based on self-report may reflect an expectation of improvement as much as actual improvement. Since most of the measured outcomes were self-reported, demand characteristics, the tendency of observed participants to report what they believe is expected of them, may have inflated some results. The sample was university students with a mean age of 22, not adolescents, the population with the deepest developmental exposure. And there was no neuroimaging. The study measured psychological outcomes, not neural reorganization directly. What it shows is functional recovery. What it doesn't show is whether anything changed at the structural level. A second 2025 study, led by Dr. John Torres at Harvard Medical School and published in JAMA Network Open, adds 2 complications that the first study didn't capture. This was a cohort study, not a randomized trial, involving nearly 400 young adults aged 18 to 24, conducted remotely across the United States between March 2024 and March 2025. Participants completed a 2-week observational baseline, during which their social media use was tracked objectively via their phones. Then, 80% opted into a 1-week social media detox. Of the participants who opted in, 295 completed the intervention. Because participants self-selected into the detox, this study has a design limitation worth naming. People who chose to detox may be more motivated, more aware of their use patterns, or more likely to improve. The study can't fully separate those factors from the effect of the detox itself. That doesn't invalidate the results, but it matters for how confidently we can generalize them. With that caveat stated, 1 week of social media reduction produced measurable improvements. Anxiety decreased by 16.1%, depression by 24.8%, insomnia by 14.5%. Measurement was objective, pulled directly from participants' phones, rather than relying solely on self-report.
Short-term recovery, again, is real. The first complication, the response was not uniform. Some participants improved substantially. Others showed almost no change. Dr. Torres described the distribution as having tremendous heterogeneity, his word, and concluded the field needs a more individualized approach rather than blanket interventions. This heterogeneity matters. It means that when someone tries a social media detox and reports feeling significantly better, they may genuinely be in the subset that responds strongly. When someone else tries the same intervention and reports feeling roughly the same, they may also be reporting accurately. Both experiences are real. Neither generalizes to everyone. The second complication is the one that requires the most careful thinking. Total screen time, measured objectively, did not decrease during the social media abstinence period. Social media time fell from approximately 2 hours per day to 30 minutes. Total screen time stayed the same. Participants removed social media and replaced the volume with other screen-based activity. This raises a question that the intervention data alone can't answer. When someone reports feeling better after a social media detox, what exactly recovered? If total screen-based consumption remained constant, the mechanism of improvement isn't simply about reducing screen exposure. Something about social media specifically, the social comparison, the variable reward of feedback, the identity signaling, the interpersonal visibility is what changed. Recovery, then, isn't just a quantity question. It's a question about which specific features of the system are producing which effects.
The first two studies measured functional recovery in young adults. This study asks a harder question. What happens to adolescent brains that are exposed to habitual checking behavior during the years when neural architecture is most actively forming? Meza, Telzer, and colleagues at the University of North Carolina published a longitudinal neuroimaging study in JAMA Pediatrics in 2023. They followed adolescents over 3 years, tracking both social media checking behavior and functional brain development using neuroimaging. Adolescents who checked social media habitually, defined as 15 or more times per day, showed a distinct developmental trajectory compared to those who checked less frequently. Over the 3 years of the study, the habitual checkers showed increasing sensitivity in neural regions associated with anticipating social feedback, the ventral striatum, the amygdala, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Their brains became progressively more reactive to the anticipation of social reward as they aged, not less. Their peers who checked less frequently showed the opposite developmental trajectory, decreasing reactivity in those same regions over time, which aligns with normative adolescent development. The divergence in trajectory is what matters here. It isn't that the habitual checkers had different brains to begin with. The study found no significant differences at baseline. The trajectories diverged over the course of the study period. The implication for recovery is specific. If the developmental trajectory of these regions diverged during adolescence, the period of highest plasticity, recovery isn't a matter of returning to a previous state. There may not be a stable pre-exposure state to return to, particularly for someone who began habitual use at 13 or 14. Recovery would mean reorganizing around a new trajectory, which the neuroscience of plasticity suggests is possible, but which hasn't been directly studied. The mandatory caveat: this study is correlational. It tracks associations between checking behavior and brain development, but it cannot establish that checking caused the developmental divergence. It's equally possible that adolescents with higher baseline sensitivity to social reward, for reasons unrelated to social media, both checked more frequently and showed this developmental pattern. The study is among the most rigorous longitudinal neuroimaging data we have on this question. It is highly suggestive. It is not proof of causation.
Two additional findings are worth naming because they complicate what recovery means in practice. The first comes from Coyne and Woodruff, published in Behavioral Sciences in 2023. 31 young adults, 2-week social media reduction, measurable improvements in well-being, and then, 2 weeks after restrictions were lifted, 90% of prior usage had returned. The sample is small enough that the exact percentage shouldn't be overgeneralized, but the pattern, rapid return to baseline behavior when external constraints are removed, is consistent with what the 2025 RCT found over a longer timeframe. The second comes from a 2024 systematic review examining social media use and psychological outcomes across multiple studies. A source I'll note in the description has incomplete citation data, meaning it requires independent verification before you follow it. With that caveat explicit, the review found that what matters for psychological well-being isn't primarily how much time is spent on social media, it's how that time is spent. Authentic use, genuine communication, connection building, creative expression correlates with clearer self-concept and lower distress. Passive consumption and social comparison correlate with the opposite. The implication is significant. Recovery framed purely as abstinence may be missing the more important variable. The question isn't only whether the brain can recover from social media exposure, it's whether the specific features of use that produce harm can be changed, while the features that don't produce harm remain accessible. That's a harder problem than simply reducing a number.
But here's where the picture gets more complicated. and intellectual honesty requires saying so directly. A longitudinal neuroimaging study by Achterberg and colleagues at Utrecht University, published in Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience in 2022, followed adolescents over 5 years and examined associations between social media use and structural brain development. The study found patterns suggesting that heavier social media users showed distinct trajectories of cortical development, including more pronounced thinning in prefrontal regions over time. This finding is often cited as evidence of structural brain changes from social media use, but the original paper contains a result that most citations omit. The association between social media use and structural brain development did not survive correction for multiple statistical comparisons, what researchers call FDR correction. The association between mental well-being and brain development did survive that correction. The association with social media use specifically did not. What this means, Achterberg et al. Is a rigorous, valuable study, but its findings about social media and structural brain change are statistically weaker than its findings about mental well-being and brain change, citing it as established evidence that social media causes structural brain changes would be overstating what the data supports. The second complicating finding comes from Odgers and Jensen, published in Nature in 2024, a systematic review of the evidence linking social media to adolescent mental health outcomes. Their conclusion was pointed: the causal evidence is considerably weaker than the public debate implies. Correlations exist, but the direction of causation, whether social media use produces psychological distress, or whether adolescents experiencing distress seek out more social media, remains genuinely unresolved by the current evidence base. This doesn't mean nothing is happening. The intervention data is real. Remove the exposure and something measurably improves. But Odgers and Jensen are pointing at a genuine gap in the causal chain, and that gap matters for how confidently we can claim to know what recovery is recovering from. 4 things the literature cannot currently tell us. Long-term structural recovery. No study has followed participants through an intervention and tracked neural changes over 2 or more years. We have short-term functional data. We have no long-term structural data. What happens neurologically after sustained environmental change remains unstudied. Onset age and the limits of reversibility. The Maza and Pelzer data suggest developmental trajectories diverge with habitual early use. Whether that divergence is permanent, partially reversible, or fully reversible with sufficient time and environmental change, we don't know. More difficult is established. Impossible is not. What recovery means neurologically. Every intervention study measures psychological outcomes, self-reported well-being, anxiety, sleep. These are proxies. They tell us something changed. They don't tell us whether what changed corresponds to neural reorganization or is a temporary behavioral effect. The gap between feeling better and the brain has reorganized is not yet bridged by the evidence. Why some people recover more than others. The heterogeneity Torres and Conrad documented, some participants improving dramatically, others barely at all, has no reliable predictor yet identified. We know the distribution is wide. We don't know what's driving the variance. So here is what the evidence actually gives us. Short-term recovery is real, measurable, and documented across multiple studies with varying methodologies. Remove the dominant input and the brain responds in mood, anxiety, sleep, and well-being within days to weeks. That recovery is fragile without structural environmental change.
When external constraints are removed and the environment reverts, the brain follows, consistently, quickly. Long-term neurological recovery, structural reorganization, developmental trajectory correction is not yet studied. It is plausible given the mechanism of neuroplasticity. It is not yet documented. The primary barrier to sustained recovery is not that the biological mechanism is absent. It is that the architecture of the environment is designed in ways that deprive that mechanism of the sustained, different input it would need to reorganize durably.
We've covered a significant amount here: intervention data, neuroimaging, the mechanics of plasticity, and where the evidence genuinely runs out. That's dense material, and I want to acknowledge that before moving forward. What the research can't capture, and what no study has yet gotten at, is how this plays out in specific, individual contexts with real structural constraints. The studies work with averages and distributions. They can't capture what it looks like when someone's entire professional network is on LinkedIn, or when their closest friendships have migrated entirely to Instagram, or when they started using algorithmically curated platforms at 12 and are now 25 and asking what the pre-exposure baseline even was. If you've tried to reduce use, and particularly if you noticed specific structural barriers that made it difficult to sustain, I'd genuinely like to understand that in the comments. Not as data collection, but because that specificity is something this kind of analysis can't arrive at on its own. The gap between what the research shows and what the experience actually looks like at the individual level is where the most interesting questions are. If this kind of analysis, specific, honest about uncertainty, willing to name what the evidence doesn't support, is what you're here for, subscribing means you'll be there for the final video when it's published next week. Next week, we close the series. The final question is the one that remains after all of that: what autonomy actually looks like inside systems that were built to minimize it, and whether the distinction between constrained agency and no agency is meaningful at all. Before we close, here's what all of this actually means taken together. We started with the question that everyone who has tried to stop eventually asks: did I break something permanently, or can it come back? The evidence says probably not permanently. The brain is not static. The mechanism that was shaped by years of algorithmic input is the same mechanism that can be reshaped by a different input. Short-term recovery is documented, real, and faster than most people expect. But here is the more honest part of the answer. Sustained recovery requires something the studies keep running into as a wall: a sustained change in dominant environmental input, not a temporary intervention, not a 2-week detox with a planned end date, a structural reorganization of the environment, how you work, where your social connections live, what information architecture you depend on, that doesn't revert when motivation fluctuates. And the architecture of that environment was built in ways that make that kind of sustained exit difficult to maintain. Every design feature that makes leaving hard produces value for someone else. That's not a conspiracy. It's the structure of the business model. The architecture that makes your exit costly is the same architecture that makes your continued engagement profitable. What you understand now that you didn't understand before this video is that the question, "Can my brain recover?" is the wrong level of analysis. The brain can recover, given the right conditions. The harder question is whether those conditions are structurally available to you, and if they aren't, what that says about the system you'd need to change. The question worth sitting with is not whether recovery is possible. It is. The question is what it actually requires, and whether the architecture of the environment you live in will allow those requirements to be met. That's not a comfortable thought, but it's the right one.